I'm going to spend more time analyzing the design principles behind an indigenous people's economic paradigm. I'm doing this because I think that really the current economic system is the biggest threat to Mother Earth and therefore the fundamental cause behind climate change. And I think if we're going to get started, as Wade provided a backdrop, there's a lot to learn from indigenous societies. I'm Eastern Cherokee, Deer Clan, and my mom used to have a saying when I was a teenager going, full out, which was basically, Rebecca Lee, if you don't change directions, you're going to end up where you're headed. Great wisdom, and so appropriate for today. Basically, I got started internationally. I'd started a Indian organization in the U.S., First Nations Development Institute, and I used to say, well, what we're learning here with culturally appropriate development, we could work around the world with indigenous communities because we would be learning more. And this was our goal, was to really look at culture and development within today's sort of modern economy. My first trip overseas then, because you have to kind of put your feet into action with what your words are saying, I'd started getting letters from all around the world from indigenous groups that I actually had never heard of. And also coming from the US, I didn't even know if they were countries or towns or villages on the address. I had no real sense of global geography. So I ignored them for a while when I was at First Nations. And then pretty soon I realized I was getting like close to 200 a year from communities, sometimes written in pencil, often written in pencil. Letters that were just really asking, we want to develop, but we do not want to give up our culture. Can you come work with us? Well, like things happen. I finally picked one out of the blue, and it was the San people in Botswana. And we decided to go over, we'd formed a group in 1994 to go over there and start just a conversation with them. We'd been invited over by a couple of their community members. And so while we were there, we'd gone over there to really begin to look at culture and development. And we were sitting out under a tree, and the Central Kalahari Game Reserve is just, well, it's enormous. And the government Park Service came up, and they basically announced that they were going to be evicted to make way for a protected area or a park. And it struck me so hard because I'm Eastern Cherokee. I don't know how many of you really know the histories, but we were forcibly removed from our ancestral territories and taken over to Oklahoma. And I thought, maybe this one point in time is why I'm here, is to be part of trying to stop this. And so we talked to them about the way we could try to set up some advocacy, some action, get some people helping us. And they were so thrilled that and I had met some of their leaders and had been completely moved by two men in particular, Kuela and Sammy. And they had been caught by the game wardens again for trying to go back to the ancestral territories that they had already started moving the folks from the boundaries of the Central Kalahari on down into Hansi. And they'd had gasoline poured up their rectums. And they were basically going to die. The only thing that Sammy and Kuela wanted was to die on their own land. And I think Wade kind of brings that to a point. And I met with them late into the night, and I told them that I would do everything I could to stop the eviction. And I would try to get them back to their homeland so that they actually could die. I couldn't do that. We weren't able. By the time we got back, Kuela and Sammy had died. And the fact that I had showed up, though, the fact that I had come back, the entire community gathered from the 6 villages. They walked for days to come to Malapo to meet with me and the people that we had brought together to talk about this issue. And one of the things that was fascinating was one of the women, I remember to this day, when we were talking about the tactics that we had used so that we could stop evictions, she jumped up and in her language, she kept going like this and like this. And we had translators because there are not a whole lot of people that speak the different San languages. And basically what she was saying was when she goes to bed at night, she's going to smell happiness. And when she wakes up in the morning, she's going to smell happiness. And I thought, smell happiness, that's odd. And that night, in order to celebrate the fact that we were really going to fight the eviction, they'd had a trance dance for us trance dance is a very rare opportunity to be part of with the San people. It's a ritual and a ceremony that goes back 40-some thousand years. And as they built this huge bonfire and as they began the singing to bring them into trance, I would close my eyes and I would hear the wind, like that. And I'd hear the grasses rustling. And I would hear snaps of twigs and cracks of branches. And I'd open my eyes, and I was sitting out on the Kalahari, which is a desert. And I was wondering how I was hearing these sounds. And I closed my eyes again, and I'd hear them again, and open my eyes. And I realized what I was hearing was the conversation of the San people, a people so tied to their land that the very language they spoke was basically those sounds that they heard from nature. And in taking those sounds from nature, they had come and crafted a language, a human language. The first human language known in anthropological research. And here we had a people so tied, so close, so much a part of nature, that the very way they spoke brought you in touch with it. And they were going to be forcibly evicted. The same happened to the Meningella pygmies, evicted from their impenetrable forest to make way for a park. In total, over 1.5 million indigenous people in Africa have been evicted, actually, to make way for parks. And I say that because I'm going to talk about an economic paradigm, but I wanted to use it as a story of what our conservation paradigm is and the way indigenous peoples organize. Every society organizes socially, politically, and economically according to its values. And here we have within indigenous people a conservation paradigm that places us directly in connection with all of nature. We are only one part of it, one small part of it, but we are seeing ourselves within a conservation paradigm as a key part in stewarding and living in harmony and balance. What we have in Western conservation a lot of times is this Western idea of pristine wilderness, which means people free, which is why we get evicted on the parks. It's a conservation paradigm that will eventually try to secure, I think the goal is 23% of the world's surface in pristine wilderness. But what about the other 80%? Of the world, of Mother Earth, of the plants and the animal lives. A conservation paradigm within indigenous peoples is one of protection and production. You protected your place because it produced for you, and it produced for you because you protected it. These paradigms are what's at work today as we sit here. And a paradigm is really how you then go forward and begin to organize your societies. Seeing yourself as separate of nature, or seeing yourself as part of, and only one part of nature. When we look at the economic paradigm, you can see it kind of build. And we've looked at, within Western economics, the two most fundamental principles, economic laws, are scarcity of resources. I call it nature pecunius, in the fact that there's a belief that nature and resources are limited and we're going to run out, which has always confounded me because of the way it operates. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy right now. But the other part of that paradigm is really the character of man, in that it's perceived and believed that we are all an aggregate of individuals with insatiable appetites. Insatiable appetites. An infinite number of wants, wanting an infinite number and variety within those wants. There's no limit. We're never content. The more we get, the more we want. As soon as we meet one horizon, we're looking to the next for more. If you believe this kind of paradigm, this economic paradigm, then what you do have is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Compare that, though, to an indigenous paradigm, an indigenous economic paradigm. And you have people who believe in prosperity of creation and a kinship-based sense of enoughness. I wanted to show a little 5-minute video to kind of try to capture. I was so fortunate to have Wade, because usually I have to explain more of a cultural context, but I think the video will bring us into the context of this culture connected to nature and a paradigm of economics. It's about 5 minutes, if we can get it up. Basically, within these economies, you have scarcity, which you design a system there for competition. Scarcity, you design a system for accumulation, which drives the growth. With prosperity of creation, you're looking at cooperation, you're looking at sharing and distribution.
How we see the world determines how we act. The Western philosopher Hobbes saw humans as engaged in a war with each other over resources, making our lives solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This view of the individual, fearful, working alone, in competition with others, now dominates Western philosophical tradition. In indigenous philosophy, we are all related as individuals, as part of a kinship-based community, and as part of nature, in balance with the whole. In most Western thought, society is seen as an aggregate of self-interested individuals, connected by competition with each other over limited resources, creating fear, insecurity, hopelessness, a scarcity of spirit. Indigenous societies see prosperity in nature. Resources are abundant, shared. Collaboration fosters environmental stewardship and balance with nature. In the Western worldview, nature is feared, its value based on hierarchy. Everything on Earth ranked, mineral, plant, animal, with humans at the top, dominating everything below. In the indigenous worldview, humans are an equal part of a vibrant, interconnected whole. Two worldviews, two very different economic systems. The dominant Western market economy, like its worldview, driven by an assumption of scarce resources, intensive centralized production, individuals with insatiable appetites, accumulating. By this standard, the market economy works. 40% of the Earth's resources owned by just 1% of the population. The combined wealth of the 3 richest individuals in the world exceeds the GDP of the poorest 47 countries. The world contains only 497 multi-billionaires, while half of its population survives on less than $2.50 a day. The indigenous economy, like its worldview, interdependent, decentralized production, extensive use of resources, promoting responsible resource management, abundance, kinship, a belief in enoughness, encourages sharing and cooperation. In the Arctic, after a successful whale hunt, Inuit kinship and reciprocal obligations ensure everyone's needs are met, fairly and equitably. Prerequisites for sustainability, the health of the economy measured by the health of the whole. Health in the market economy, measured by gross domestic product. The more we produce, consume, the better the economy. Construction of buildings, manufacturing, transportation, all considered positive production, but so is production of weapons, cigarettes. While investments like healthcare, education are considered costs, negative economic productivity. And the impact on GDP of the physical and emotional costs of warfare, or the pollution that threatens 1/3 of the world's animal species? Irrelevant externalities outside the system, not even making it onto the balance sheet. an unsustainable system where scarcity of resources is a self-fulfilling prophecy. There is an alternative. Indigenous peoples' territory spans 24% of the Earth's land surface, but is home to 80% of its total biodiversity. This is not a coincidence. In indigenous cultures, balance and harmony aren't romantic notions, but millennia-old design fundamentals. Nature essential for survival, production and protection together, economic success sustainable, creating well-being for all. First Peoples funds indigenous models and traditional practices that offer insights to creating an alternative economy which promotes balance with nature and communal harmony.
When we talk about sharing, and Wade did a lot about this from a cultural point of sharing, but from an economic point of sharing, I wanted to show you how strong that culture is. What we did was we mapped a subsistence harvest take and the sharing points of how the whale was distributed. And if you look at that, you cannot really count how many places those pieces of whale meat get shared and distributed. We did the same village and we did cash. This is the sharing network to a cash economy. So when you go in a lot of times into a community, when you see that sharing, it's not just quaint cultural customs. It's a vibrant economy that is at work, whose goal is sustainability. Indigenous people's fundamental value was sustainability, and they conducted their livelihoods in ways that sustained resources and limited inequalities in their society. Indigenous economies, or what are called subsistence economies. I don't like to use that term subsistence because it so often means like eking out an existence. But a subsistence economy isn't just merely the hunting, fishing, and foraging activities. Instead, it embodies an entire way of life. It links our generations and extended families through traditional law, legends, and ceremonies. All of these laws, legends, and ceremonies are tied by a common concern for the land, water, and the resources. When we talk about living in harmony and balance, these aren't romantic notions for an indigenous economy. They are fundamental design principles. There are 4 germane characteristics. Nature is a source of knowledge, a model to emulate, and a mentor. Community is essential for survival. Equity and justice within the community members and between the communities is recognized as central to sustainability. Culture and interplay of spiritual beliefs define the relationships and regulate allocation and communal use over all capital, all forms of capital, all natural resources. Subsistence is a complex economic system with axes formed by interdependence and sharing. It requires organized labor. It operates according to a complex network of associations, rights, and obligations. Small groups, families, extended families, all determine the production and are the production units. They serve as the basis also for distribution, sharing, and trading throughout the inter and intra-community networks and commerce patterns. Producers are consumers, owners, users, and peers and superiors, all at the same time. They form a flexible production unit that shifts and changes according to what needs to be done and who has the skills. Cooperation is key. There are no intrinsic advantage among the members of the community or society. Common usage rights are flexible, they're negotiated, and they're renegotiated on an ongoing basis. The mere fact you are born, you are given economic rights, usage rights by the clans. So you have your mother's clan, your father's clan, and you have economic, that'd be like the minute you're born, you get a bank account with money in it, just because you were born. I want to talk about, because a lot of times when I talk about this, and I was fascinated with Wade too, I think we get a lot of pushback, I think, on, well, the only reason that works is because it's small scale. Or the only reason it works, well, usually it's like the only reason it works is because it's small scale, or are you trying to stop time and live in a time warp? But I want to talk about one story that I think hopefully illuminates that this doesn't have to do with scale. It doesn't have to do with technology. It has to do with our values and how we organize. The story starts in 1968, when an entire industry was on the verge of collapse. It was losing $1 million a day, and in 1968, that's a phenomenal amount of money, which I think is still a lot today. It was characterized by a few dominant major players, proprietary players. It also had a strangling, rigid web of regulations. It had immensely competing interests. Sheer desperation led to reorganizing this industry. And lo and behold, the industry, this new entity, was organized on the exact design principles of an indigenous economy. Community is essential. The entity is owned, but it cannot be bought or sold. Ownership financing is equitable. Equity and justice within and among members is essential. No one gets the upper hand in this industry. There's no intrinsic advantage among one or small groups within the greater whole. Cooperation is key. Production units are flexible networks that change and shift. Members are simultaneously owners, customers, peers, subordinates, superiors. Small groups, networks, and extended networks operate and grow. The structure is infinitely malleable and adaptable, but extremely durable. Does anybody know the industry I'm talking about? Visa, the credit card industry. It's more than 23,000 financial institutions in over 274 countries. The banks had to come together to distribute credit as widely as possible. They didn't want to distribute wealth, don't get me wrong. They wanted to distribute credit. So they basically set up, a bank owns Visa, but no one bank can sell Visa. Small blocks of banks within Visa, or even the largest bank within Visa, has no more power than Pipestone in Montana, Pipestone Bank in Montana. But it clears more financial transactions in a week than the Federal Reserve does in a year. I tell this story again to illuminate that it's not about size, it's about values. The principles that we have in an indigenous economy operate both locally and globally. Indigenous economies utilize the greatest diversity, not monocropping. But with deliberate efforts, they also increase diversity, because it's seen as diversification increases productivity and it reduces risk. It's just the opposite of what we're seeing happen in the agricultural industry, really. But we saw what happened with Ireland with the potatoes when there was only one crop. Indigenous people are always looking at their habitats from a way of how they can increase diversity, as seeing it as a way for stability and sustainability. All decisions are based on minimum yield, not average or maximum. You hear that in a saying about unto this seventh generation, each decision should be made. It's that ability to look at minimum yield because you want the maximum for the future. Technology is harnessed according to social values and order. And let me talk about the values again. I come from a matrilineal society. The Cherokees were matrilineal. The women ruled the tribe during times of peace. They were the white council. Excuse me, let me get some water. Thanks. I'm on cough medicine, so I wouldn't cough at you, but now I'm going to be completely dried up. We're looking at the seventh generation in the decisions and technology harnessed by our social values and order. one of the things I said as a Cherokee woman, the values of our nation and our society were balance and harmony. So let's talk for a minute about the political. With a white council, we were able to bring the strength, the female power, into play for making decisions that was best for the whole. The Red Council was the Men's Council. We were able to bring through the Men's Council during time of war the strategies and the tactical information that we needed to preserve our territories and our peoples. We also have, when we're looking at, again, on the seventh generation in my own tribe, being matrilineal, you could marry the woman. The children took the woman's name, was passed on in a matrilineal fashion. Divorce had no stigma. However, because again, the value was on the future generations, all property stayed with the children. The children were not brought to a court as a piece of property to be fought over. All material property was actually attached to the children, so that the future was protected, so that the children and the seventh generations were protected. We've used these same principles a number of times in a contemporary sense. I had the honor to work with the Pine Ridge people, the Lakota Nation out in South Dakota, and it was the first microenterprise loan fund in the United States. And at the time, we actually didn't even have the word microloan, microfinance. We were saying little tiny baby loans. And then the Ford Foundation was funding us, and so they thought they'd run into Dr. Enoughness over in Grameen, who was doing a microfinance bank, and so the Grameen Bank, and so they brought him over to Pine Ridge and us over to Bangladesh to see each other's work. And it was, I'm getting a little off track here, but it was really exciting because in Bangladesh, there's 1,800 people per square mile, and in Pine Ridge, it's 1.8 people per square mile. So poor Dr. Enoughness was scared to death to leave our side because he couldn't see it. It was just vast expanse. And when we got over there, we were like, you see pictures of us, even when we could stand a little bit wider, we're standing like this because we felt so completely crowded with all the people over there. It was an incredible experience. But it got me really thinking again of these design principles and how can we connect capital to community in ways that make our communities flourish, because I'd seen the capital flows continually going up, out of your community to maybe if you were in Pine Ridge, it went up to Minneapolis. From Minneapolis, it goes to New York. From New York, it gets packaged and repackaged and cut into derivatives. So how can we change this? Well, basically, I was on the Calvert Social Investment Fund's board, which was a mutual fund, and I made a passionate plea to our shareholders that poor people were creditworthy. And I talked about the Lakota Fund, and I talked about the difference it was making. It was a multi-income strategy. Again, looking at this particular slide, what we were trying to do was do development that took into account the kind of broad-based distribution of opportunity and resources that our cultures operated by. When we got to Calvert, we had the shareholder meeting. I had the microphone, and the founder, Wayne Silby, was sitting there, and all of a sudden a woman in the audience jumps up and she said, because I'd said we could just use 1% of the portfolio to invest in low-income loan funds. And a shareholder jumps up and she goes, let's do 5%. Pretty soon someone jumped up and said, well, I think we could do 10%. About that point, even I was thinking, well, let's just try 1% to see how this works. You know, I'm looking at Wayne like, you know, and so we started the high social impact investing, which basically the goal was to become an asset class in and of itself. It became what's called community notes, and it literally has over $1 billion flowing through it today, going into global funds, into domestic funds, into many of the low-income community development financial institutions that have gone into effect as we all began looking at new and more creative ways to do financing. My point in this story is that it's really happening. It's really these design principles that we need to take into our institutions today because they are not working across the board. And what I'd like to do is show how we do this work at First Peoples. And we have a small fund that we make grants directly to indigenous communities. Now, 1/3 of our portfolio is going to communities that have never, ever received funding before or handled money before. We were very deliberate in wanting to look at a reach that was deeply within our grassroots communities, within our traditional societies, and begin to put small amounts of money to see what would come from their own designs, from their own ideas, from their own problem solving. And I brought some of the grantees to show you this time. We're in over 70 countries right now through Keepers of the Earth, and some of the principles that we're seeing come out. And these are small grants, so we're not providing a tremendous amount of design technical assistance. We're just providing anywhere from $500 to $10,000 or $20,000. The first one is really the worldview. And in fact, this is the Lobarkinji community in Samburu. It's one of 7 main pastoral tribes in Kenya. The subsistence activities are mainly cattle, goat, and camel. But, like I said before, that livestock cements the social relations and spiritual life of the Samburu. The government decided to evict them, and our grant basically went to support them to map their land and document it for formal land rights. But this has spread. They're working with 7 other tribes now in the Kenya area on what they learned, that connection, that interdependency among the groups is vibrant in this particular project. And it made international news in December 2011 because they won the right to stay on their lands, and they won the right also to become co-managers of some of the parks in the areas. This is a fascinating group in Altai, Russia. It's up there, the understanding is land has breath. It's an umbilical cord, nose, mouth, eyes, and ears. It's alive, it's sensate, it senses, we sense. We are so part of it. Everything that exists on earth is alive. And in order to honor that, in order to celebrate that, they have traditional songs of Altai, Russia, that they sing. And this is basically one of the ceremonies they're doing where they sing the song of life and they tamp when they walk. They walk in a manner that is believed to take the energy and in reciprocity tamp that energy back into Mother Earth and thank her for her providing the essentials. We fund the traditional knowledge of the Altai and the local leaders and the elders and the shaman. And this project has grown actually to a regional forum within Russia, and it covers right now 4 other villages. And we've hooked it up with a scientific group that are beginning to work with them to try to document any kind of indicators or outcomes from that. This one, though, is balance and harmony are not romantic notions. We have to get away from that and begin to understand they are fundamental design principles. This is the Batwa and the Bumtuni, who've lived for a millennia within the Ituri forests northeast of the DCR. And basically, they pretty much have been practicing subsistence lifestyles. But again, what we were looking at was the evictions from the national parks. And so our small grant, $5,000 grant, is funding them to work within the guerrilla conservation areas and to really start bringing some of their conservation paradigm into the conservation that is already taking place in the areas. We're funding that. We started it with just the beginning of their getting together, and we're actually funding co-management training now, and they're beginning to network on that, but they haven't expanded past their immediate village yet. This one is about looking at nature as prosperity. When I talked about the prosperity of creation, people can argue we are going to run out of fossil fuel, absolutely. But the prosperity of creation would look at wind, look at solar. The ability to look at nature from a point of prosperity changes the way you're going to design your structures. This group had severe food insecurity, malnutrition, no clean water. We basically funded the women of the Lou community in Kenya, and they've already installed 250 multi-story food gardens, 5 new water catchment systems, and a network of 20 community food and health providers. By working together and by building the food storage gardens, they're beginning to bring back this sense of the prosperity that's within creation. The flexible production units that I talked about could be seen in the project in El Salvador. The Nahut community in El Salvador builds sustainable villages using traditional knowledge and appropriate technology. They're building a network, or a practitioner's network, basically, of folks who can build solar pumps. And they're building composting toilets and training the community in its use. They have replanted over 3,000 trees to buffer the tropical rain damage, and over 100 people are involved in production, and they're taking it to 3 other villages in looking at the permaculture project. And again, what I say, when we fund community-based projects and designs, so by the time they come into us, we haven't handed any of these principles out. We're not saying your projects will be funded if they do this, this, and this. These are coming straight in. In many of the communities, we've changed our grant making so that it's not about give us your problem statement, give us your goals, give us your measurable objectives and your activity charts. That's not the way Indigenous people think. We think from a systems, holistic point of view. So we say, tell us a story. What's your community? What's going on in your community, and what does your community want to? What's it doing, and what's it facing, and what are you doing about it? And we also take a lot of the proposals in by Skype, and we take our reports in by Skype, because we're really dealing with a grant-making system that is to reach, like I said, the most traditional of our communities. This is what we're getting back. Here we have the paradigm I talked about earlier of protection and production, production and protection. You protected your place because it produced for you, and it only produced for you because you protected it. There's a number of tribal groups in the Nakuno district in Uganda, and what was happening was polyurethane bags were coming in from all different points around the community, and they were destroying the land. So basically 30 young girls got together, and they were trained by this elder woman to make bags from the palm trees and bark cloth. And that's what you see them doing. Our grant went to actually, not to get started, they had actually already started when they wrote us. Our grant went in to help them train 5 other villages in how to make these palm and bark bags. And this is where we go back to, again, the indigenous sense of the interdependence and the interconnections. And these were basically, they started with 10 weavers in Cusco, Peru. And in order to really, this was more of an economic project in a true sense, except it was fascinating the way they were looking at, in order to be more economic productive, they wanted to build more flexible units of production. So they came to us to really take this to take the polyurethane and palm and grass bags to 5 more villages. What we've seen in coming in from the community is it's the paradigm that drives the design. And we've seen from smallest projects to our larger projects, there's always a connection of looking at balance, of looking at flexible production, of the prosperity within creation. There's one fellow named Jerome Lewis, who's an anthropologist over at Cambridge University, and he did a study of the Batwa Pygmies. And what was fascinating was he was talking about how there's absolutely no words in their language for scarcity. And so they were evicted from their parks, and they were sitting basically on the sides in some of the most depressing and devastating situations and circumstances that any of us could imagine. And they radiated and they beamed a happiness, caught up in a confusion for feeling completely responsible for what was happening to the forest because they had stopped performing the obligations of taking care of and stewarding the forest. Like I said, every society organizes itself socially, politically, and economically according to its values. It's not a coincidence that 80% of all remaining biodiversity lives on indigenous territories. Combined, we have about 20% or up to 24% of the Earth's surface, with 80% of the remaining biodiversity. Protection and production, production and protection truly works. And that's it. Thank you. Just throw 'em out.